On February 14th, while I lay curled beneath a thin hospital blanket with tubes in my arm and a fading pulse in my wrist, my son sold my house without telling me. The same house where he learned to walk across the yellow linoleum, where I painted clouds above his crib, where his father died. I didn't find out until 2 weeks later, when the discharge nurse told me I'd need a new mailing address. She said it so casually I thought I'd misheard her. I'm Helen Marcus. I'm 69. And that was the moment I knew I was no longer part of my family, only their burden, their loose end to tie up. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I was still weak from the pneumonia. The kind that rattles the ribs like wind through dry branches. When I called my son, he said it was all handled. He had handled it. Handled me. The key didn't work anymore when I was dropped off in a taxi, he'd changed the locks. My blue hydrangeas had been pulled up like weeds. My wind chimes were gone. I sat on the curb with my discharge papers in my lap, blinking at the real estate sign I hadn't known was ever there. It felt like a death, but no one had died, only a line in the sand had been drawn. Quietly. Without me. I've heard people say betrayal is loud, a slammed door, a shouted curse, an explosive moment. But that's not true. It's a silence. A choice made without your name in the room. The house was in my name. Or so I thought. But I had let him help me manage the paperwork last year, when my vision started to blur. We sat at the kitchen table, and he walked me through some forms so gently. So lovingly. I had no idea I was signing away the last of my roots. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, some legal mix-up, a misunderstanding we could undo. But when I called him again, he didn't even deny it. He said, "Mom, we needed to do what made sense." We. As if I wasn't part of we anymore. He'd moved me into a rented unit across town, temporary housing while we figured things out. A twin bed, one plate, one fork, and my medication bottles stacked like soldiers by the sink. That was when I stopped calling him. That was when I decided I would never again beg to be seen. Never again ask where I belonged. He didn't know the years I spent binding that family together like stitches on a wound. He didn't know what it took to become invisible. Until I did it on purpose. And that was only the beginning. It's easy, I think, to forget what mothers give. We give it so early and so constantly that it becomes part of the wallpaper, soft, dependable, always there but never noticed. Until, one day, it's not. I remember when my son was born. March 17, 1981. A cold morning, snow still tucked along the sides of the road like folded sheets. I held him in the dim light of room 204 at St. Agnes Hospital, and I whispered a promise into the downy crown of his head, that I would never let him go unseen. I would be the one to remember. That's what motherhood was, for me, remembering. All of it. I remembered which blanket he liked best, the one with the ducks. I remembered to pack his favorite apple slices with cinnamon in his lunch, even when I had a migraine that blurred the whole left side of my head. I remembered to wash the lice comb in boiling water after every outbreak in 3rd grade. I remembered the tooth that came out on Christmas Eve and how I tiptoed, exhausted, to slip a crumpled dollar beneath his pillow with shaking fingers. I remembered his friends' names. His allergies. His favorite teacher, Miss Penrose. I remembered when he forgot to do that science project and stayed up crying until 2 a.m. And I stayed up with him, cutting tiny solar panels out of tinfoil and helping him glue a model Mars rover together so he wouldn't go to school with empty hands. And that's the thing. He never did go to school with empty hands. I made sure of that. I gave more than money. Though I gave that too. My husband, Leonard, was a mechanic for 32 years until the arthritis in his fingers turned the bolts against him. When we couldn't stretch his pension, I picked up nights at the grocery store. My hands cracked from bagging cold dairy for 7 hours straight, but I never let the fridge go bare. When Leonard was dying, slow, bitter, breath by breath, I became nurse and wife and mother, all layered into one. I remember the night I had to change his bandages and my son wouldn't come out of his room. He said the smell made him feel sick. I didn't blame him. He was only 16. But I remember that, too. I remember the insurance calls. The medical bills. The day I sold my engagement ring to cover the cost of Leonard's oxygen machine. I didn't cry. I wrapped it in the same blue paper it had come in, and I handed it over to a man with a lazy eye who gave me $300. My son never knew about that. He just noticed that I stopped wearing it. There were birthdays, his, of course. I always baked the same chocolate cake with peanut butter frosting, the one his grandmother used to make before her hands went numb. He never liked store-bought cakes. Too sweet. Even when he moved out, I made that cake every year. Left it on the porch if he didn't answer the door. Sometimes it sat there, untouched, for days. I'd come back and see the ants picking it clean. He never said thank you. But I told myself that wasn't why I did it. I did it because I loved him. And because that's what I thought love was, quiet, steady work. Work that no one clapped for. Work that was never supposed to be noticed. But I noticed. I noticed everything. I remember the year he lost his job. 2012, he had a wife then, Rebecca, and 2 small children who called me grandma only when it was convenient. They moved in with me for 7 months. 7 months of laundry, dishes, electric bills that climbed like ivy up the wall. I made space for them in every room. I gave up my bed so the children could have a real mattress. I slept on the couch with a heating pad and prayed my back wouldn't seize before morning. Rebecca told me once that I was too available. I think she meant it as a joke. I never told her that I heard them, in the back bedroom, whispering about how they needed to get out of my sad little house. I still made them pancakes the next morning. The thing is, you don't stop giving just because you're tired. You stop when you're emptied. And even then, I didn't stop. I paid for my grandson's braces. Not because they asked me to, but because I saw the way he covered his mouth when he laughed. I sent money when their car broke down. I babysat so they could go on anniversary trips. I was never asked what I needed. I was always the one doing the asking. Can I help? Can I bring something? Do you need a break? They'd laugh. You don't have to, Mom. But I did. Because somewhere along the way, my worth became tied to how much I could make easier for other people. And the scariest thing, the thing that still haunts me, is how much I participated in my own erasure. I never told them when my own knees began to ache. When I started forgetting names, or how long the kettle had been on the stove. When I woke up some mornings feeling like the only sound in an abandoned church. I never said, I'm lonely. I just waited for someone to notice. They never did. And still, I kept giving. Because I thought that was what mothers did. You give until there is nothing left, and even then, you offer the echo of yourself. I was proud of how strong I was. Proud that I never made them feel guilty. Proud that I could hold 1,000 quiet disappointments and never let one of them spill into my voice. But pride is heavy when you carry it alone. And after the hospital, after the house, I began to ask myself something I had never dared ask before. What had they ever truly given me, without expecting something in return? What had they remembered about me? My favorite color? My middle name? The way I like my tea steeped? I had memorized their entire lives. But when I disappeared for 3 days after being discharged, not one of them called. Not one. I sat in that strange little apartment, the one he'd handled for me, and I looked at the single cup in the cupboard, the single spoon. And I thought, this is exactly what they think I am now. A woman with nothing. A woman with no need for a table set for more than one. But they were wrong. I may have given too much. But that doesn't mean I have nothing left. It just means that what I have now, whatever it is, I will keep for myself. And that quiet promise, that flicker of resolve, would grow in me like a seed planted beneath winter soil. Because the things I did for them weren't a weakness. They were proof. Proof of what I could survive. And they would see. Even if they never looked back. It doesn't come all at once, the unraveling. You think it will. You think the pain of being forgotten or dismissed will knock you flat in a single blow. But the truth is quieter than that. It comes like slow rust, edge by edge, fleck by fleck, until you realize the whole frame of your life has corroded beneath your fingers. There wasn't a moment where my son stopped loving me. No declaration. No slammed door. No cruel words. Just a series of things not said. Not done. Not remembered. The forgetting started small. He used to call on Sundays. That was our rhythm. Even after he moved out, got married, had children, he'd still call Sunday evenings. I'd brew a cup of tea and wait by the phone. Not doing anything else, not folding laundry, not watching TV. Just waiting. And then one Sunday, he didn't call. I waited. Told myself he was busy. Work, probably. Or the kids had a game. But he didn't call the next week either. Eventually the rhythm changed. Weekly became monthly. Then only on birthdays. Then not even then. I told myself it wasn't personal. Everyone gets busy. Everyone grows up. But that's the lie mothers tell ourselves, that neglect is just a sign of adulthood. Once, after Leonard passed, I fell on the icy back steps and twisted my ankle. I crawled back inside, and I sat on the floor of the kitchen, holding my breath through the pain. I called my son. He didn't answer. Left a message. He called back 2 days later, asked if I had Advil. I told him I was fine. And I was, in the same way a cracked teacup still holds water, just not for long. There were other hurts, too. Like the Thanksgiving I cooked everything and they showed up late, 2 hours late, and by then the turkey was cold and the green beans had wilted. Rebecca laughed and said they'd stopped at a drive-thru on the way because the kids were hungry. I remember standing there in my apron, smiling with the same mouth I'd used to whisper lullabies. Telling them it was fine. That I understood. But I didn't. And I didn't understand when they started making decisions without telling me. They'd go on vacations and I'd see the pictures posted online. Trips to Maine, to Mexico, once even to Europe, smiling in front of cathedrals, beaches, city squares I'd only seen in old calendars. I was never invited. Not once. I tried not to take it to heart. But it settled there anyway. Even at Christmas? When I used to send carefully chosen gifts, wrapped with ribbon and notes tucked inside, I'd see my envelopes left unopened on their counter. A sweater that stayed in its plastic bag. A book I knew he'd love that stayed unread. There's a particular ache that comes from being politely ignored. Not hated. Not yelled at. Just set aside. Once, when I was visiting, I mentioned a memory, a small thing, a story from when he was little. He didn't remember. His wife looked bored. His daughter scrolled on her phone. And I realized that everything I had carried, the moments, the sweetness, the little details of his childhood, existed only in me. They lived nowhere else. Which meant that, when I was gone, they would be gone too. That's a heavy kind of loneliness. Another time, I tried to give my grandson an old wooden puzzle, the kind his father used to play with for hours. I had kept it in the hall closet for decades. He looked at it, then at his father, and said, "This is junk." My son didn't correct him. Just shrugged. I placed the puzzle back in the closet when I got home. I haven't touched it since. It's not that I wanted to be worshipped or thanked. I didn't need flowers or speeches. I just wanted to be seen. To be spoken to with warmth. To be included in a way that said, "You matter. Your presence makes a difference." Instead, I was tolerated. And that may be the cruelest kind of dismissal. Being allowed to exist in the room, but never in the heart. There was also control. Small comments. Little corrections. About how I dressed. About how I spoke. About how I shouldn't overshare when we were around the kids. Once, my son told me, "Mom, you talk too much about the past." It's weird. The past was all I had left. He had the future. I had memories. And even those were being taken from me, as if they embarrassed him. So I learned to go quiet. To offer less. I started arriving later and leaving earlier. I stopped baking cakes. Stopped offering to help. They didn't notice. That was the hardest part. They didn't miss the things I stopped doing, because they never really saw them to begin with. You can only be invisible for so long before you start to believe you were never really there. One evening, while watching a video on my old laptop, a clip from my son's third-grade recital, I noticed something. In the video, I was clapping harder than anyone. You could hear my voice cheering above the crowd. He never looked up. Not once. Even then, he didn't see me. That night I sat by the window, the light from the street lamp casting a pale circle across the rug, and I tried to name each time I'd felt forgotten. I lost count. But I didn't cry. Because this kind of hurt doesn't come with tears. It comes with a quiet pulling away, a gradual retreat into yourself. And that's what I began to do. Pull away. Not out of anger. But out of clarity. There was nothing left for me in that version of family. No space where I could lay down my memories and be met with kindness. Just 100 quiet hurts, each one like a stone slipped into my coat pocket. And I was getting tired of carrying them. The next part of my story begins with a single moment. One betrayal that didn't come slowly. One that came all at once. The moment the line was crossed, and something in me finally broke. The final line they crossed wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting, or lawyers at the door, or any kind of scene at all. It came in the form of an envelope, quietly slid through the mail slot in my temporary apartment. I remember the sound, the soft thud on the linoleum. I was slicing an apple. It was a Granny Smith, tart and cold from the fridge, and the knife had just touched the core when I heard it. I thought it was junk mail. I almost didn't open it. But something about the return address caught my eye. It was a law firm. One I didn't recognize. Inside was a notice, cleanly printed, polite, and utterly devastating. It said the house on Hemlock Street had been legally transferred months ago. Sold to a development company. Gutted, they wrote. Under renovation. My hands started shaking before I finished reading. Because that house wasn't just a house. It was mine. Not in the possessive, greedy sense. In the way a tree belongs to the soil it grew in. That place had held everything I was. The birth of my son. My husband's last breath. The little markings on the wall where we charted height with a pencil. The floorboards that creaked in a language I had learned by heart. And it was gone. Not offered. Not discussed. Not even mentioned. I stared at the letter and felt something slide out of me, like breath after a long run. It wasn't shock. I had passed that stage long ago. It was a slow, final understanding. That I was no longer seen as a person, but a problem to be managed. They hadn't called it theft. But that's what it was. My name had once been on the deed. But in the long months before I got sick, while I was confused, tired, easily overwhelmed, my son had offered to help. He sat with me at the dining room table, a manila folder in hand, papers already filled in. He said it was just to make things easier. Just a safety net in case something happened. He knew I didn't understand half the legal language. He knew I trusted him. He knew I had been tired for weeks. I had thought he was looking out for me. But what he did was something else entirely. I called the law firm from the letter. The woman on the line was kind, but careful. She said everything had been processed correctly. I asked her if my signature was on the documents. She paused. Then said, "Yes, ma'am, it appears so." And I remembered the pen in my hand that day. How I signed without reading, because my son was tapping the table softly, urging me along. I remembered the warmth in his voice. How he patted my shoulder when I hesitated. I signed my life away to a man who had been inside me. Who I had held against my chest while he screamed in his first hours of life. Who I had fed, clothed, protected, defended for decades. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones who know where you're softest. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream or accuse. Instead, I hung up the phone and sat very still for a very long time. It was a cold day. The heat in the apartment didn't reach the corners of the room, and my feet were numb even in socks. I looked around at the small space, the kitchenette with no oven, the bed shoved against the wall, the lone plant wilting on the sill. And I realized, with a clarity that made my breath catch, this was how they saw me now. An old woman who didn't need space. Didn't need memory. Didn't need choice. They had erased my life and called it care. A week later, I took the bus to Hemlock Street. I wore my heaviest coat, the navy one with the deep pockets. I didn't know what I expected to find. But the house was gone. Not structurally, it was still standing. But the porch swing was missing. The garden beds had been dug up. The siding was stripped, the windows replaced, the front door a flat modern gray that didn't know my name. I stood on the sidewalk with my gloved hands folded and watched men in vests carry out cabinets, my cabinets, and toss them into a dumpster. They didn't look at me. They had no reason to. I was no longer part of that place. I stood there until my legs ached. Then I turned and walked away. It wasn't just the house they took. It was the version of me that believed I had a place in their future. I thought about calling him. I thought about saying, "You could have asked." But what would that have changed? You can't force someone to see value in you. You can only decide whether you'll keep offering it for free. That night, I packed a small bag. I took only what I needed. Clothes. Some papers. A framed photo of Leonard and me, before the sickness hollowed him out. And I left that apartment. That holding cell dressed as shelter, without telling anyone. I knew I'd need help. And I would get it. But not from them. Not from the ones who had taught me I was disposable. The betrayal had already happened. The ink had already dried. But what came next, that was mine to decide. I wouldn't fight to reclaim what was taken. I had something else in mind. Because I had nothing left to lose. And in that emptiness, there was room to build. What they broke in me wasn't my spirit. It was my silence. And in that quiet breaking, something new began to rise. I didn't leave with a plan. There was no itinerary. No calendar marked with dates. No folder full of directions or spreadsheets or retirement numbers neatly totaled. There was only me, a canvas bag, and the sound of the door closing behind me, soft, final. Silence wasn't something I was used to. Not the kind that comes from within. I'd lived a whole life full of words, small talk over breakfasts, gentle reminders folded into lunchboxes, soft instructions in doctors' waiting rooms, long phone calls to the pharmacy, to the school, to the bank. Words were how I showed up in the world. How I mothered. How I loved. But after the house, after the final envelope, I didn't feel like speaking anymore. Not to them. Not about it. silence became the only thing I had that was fully mine. I took a room at a quiet motel along Route 17, just outside the edge of town where the highway meets the pine groves. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions as long as you paid in cash. Room 12 had a window that faced the trees and a faint smell of mildew that clung to the curtains, but it was warm. And for the first time in months, I slept through the night. No calls. No obligations. No one knocking, asking if I was okay. I was okay. More than that, I was beginning to feel something unfamiliar through peace. There's a strange stillness that comes after devastation. When the worst has already happened, when the thing you feared most has already been taken, there is a kind of freedom in what's left behind. I began to write things down. Not letters. Not yet. Just memories. Little ones. The way Leonard used to whistle when he chopped onions. The sound of my son's bare feet running down the hall when he was 5. The feel of sunlight in the kitchen at 10 a.m. in late spring. I wrote them on napkins, motel stationery, the backs of receipts. It made me feel anchored, even if the world around me didn't know where I'd gone. I didn't disappear out of revenge. I disappeared because I needed to remember who I was when no one was watching. Some days, I'd take long walks down roads I didn't know. Not looking for anything. Just putting one foot in front of the other. I'd pass families unloading groceries, children on bicycles, people drinking coffee on porches. None of them knew me. None of them needed anything from me. I could breathe there. And somewhere along the edges of those days, I started taking care of myself in small, gentle ways. Not the rushed, tired care I used to give myself when I had energy left over. But intentional, present care. I bought a soft blue sweater from a second-hand shop. I got my hair trimmed for the first time in over a year. I ordered tea in a cafe and stayed until it was dark. And I started saving. It wasn't much, a bit from Social Security, a refund check that finally arrived, some money I'd quietly tucked away before things went bad. Every dollar became a promise. Not to buy anything flashy. But to build something mine. I met a woman named Josie in the motel laundry room. She was maybe 10 years younger than me, a widow, traveling through town in a dented red pickup with her dog. We spoke in soft starts and pauses. She didn't ask where I came from. I didn't ask where she was going. But she gave me the number of a legal aid office downtown. Said they helped women like us. At first, I hesitated. I had always been the kind of woman who didn't ask for help unless she was bleeding. But something in me knew I couldn't stay in hiding forever. So one Wednesday, under gray clouds and a cold breeze, I walked into that office and told the receptionist my name. The lawyer assigned to me was a quiet man with kind eyes and a notepad full of patience. He listened. Really listened. And when I told him what had happened, about the documents, the signature, the sale, he didn't blink. He said something that startled me. "You're not crazy. This happens more than people think." That sentence sat with me for days. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't ungrateful or difficult or imagining things. What they did was wrong. Legally questionable, at best. There was paperwork to untangle. A long process. But he didn't promise a win. He promised effort. And that was enough. I left that office with a copy of my file and the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Dignity. I started reading, too. Checked out books from the little library branch up the road, books on aging, boundaries, financial autonomy. I took notes. I studied. I learned what had happened to me had a name. Elder financial abuse. I'd never seen myself in that category. I still don't like how it sounds. But naming it gave it shape. And when something has shape, you can move around it. You can rebuild. I didn't contact my son. Not once. He didn't try to reach me either. At least, not directly. There was one message, maybe 2 months after I disappeared. Blocked number. Just a voicemail with his voice, light, casual, saying he hoped I was doing okay and wanted to clear the air. I didn't return the call. There was nothing left to clear. Just a field of silence where trust had once lived. That was the power of going quiet. They couldn't twist my words anymore. They couldn't guilt me with tone or posture. They couldn't pull me back into a place I no longer belonged. In my silence, I found my edge. Not bitterness. Not rage. Just a line. Drawn gently. Finally. And that line would become my compass. I wasn't lost. I was finding my way, one quiet, deliberate step at a time. There's a kind of power that lives in the stillness. Not the power to hurt. The power to heal. And that's what I was doing now, not escaping, not punishing, just healing in a place no one could reach. Because silence, when it's chosen, isn't absence. It's reclamation. I don't remember the exact day it shifted. When my steps stopped feeling like escape and began to feel like direction. It wasn't a big moment. There was no grand sunrise, no life-altering encounter. It was more like waking up and realizing you're breathing easier than you did the day before. That winter, I stayed in that motel for 8 weeks. Longer than I meant to. But I needed that in between. I needed the time to sit with the truth. To know I wasn't going back. Back to the way things were. Back to being on the outer edge of my own life. Back to offering everything and holding nothing. Something quiet and firm had settled in me during those days, a root I hadn't realized was taking hold. And I moved differently after that. Not quickly. Not boldly. Just steadily. I found a small room in a converted farmhouse 40 miles north, near a town called Elmbrook. I saw the listing on a corkboard in the library. It was handwritten, the paper soft at the corners, thumbtacked between a flyer for piano lessons and a lost dog poster. Furnished studio above garage. Quiet. Month to month. No smoking. Ideal for one. That was all it said. I called the number, expecting it to be gone already. But it wasn't. The woman who answered had a voice like worn cotton. Her name was Evelyn. She said I could come by that afternoon. The studio was simple. A single room above her detached garage, with a kitchenette, a bed with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, and a window that looked out over a field of tall grass. I didn't have to think. I handed her the cash I'd been saving and signed nothing but a receipt. Evelyn didn't ask why I was there. She didn't ask where I came from. She just said, if you need quiet, this is a good place for it. And it was. Each morning, I made tea and sat by the window, watching the deer slip through the tall brush. I'd write down one thing I wanted to remember and one thing I was willing to forget. I planted rosemary in a small pot. I read novels I never had time for before. And I started walking again, real walks, not just the ones that came from needing to leave something behind. There was a trail near the back of Evelyn's property, narrow and lined with wild raspberries. I'd follow it until the trees opened and the sky widened. There, I'd sit on a flat rock and close my eyes. And slowly, I stopped thinking about them. Not every day. But some days. That was progress. I got a part-time job at the second-hand bookstore in town. 3 afternoons a week, sorting used titles and stacking returns. The owner was a quiet man named Arthur who didn't say much, just nodded when I arrived and left me to it. I liked the rhythm of it. The order. The way stories could be held, passed on, reshaped by new hands. I started recognizing regulars. A teenager who read poetry like it was a secret. A retired couple who always bickered over mysteries. A young mother who brought her baby in a sling and whispered titles aloud as if the child could understand. I didn't tell them my story. I didn't need to. In that space, I was just Helen, not mom, not grandma, not a burden to be managed. Just a woman who liked books and came in on Tuesdays. One evening, after closing, Arthur offered me an old copy of a journal he thought I'd like, leather-bound, never written in. "You seem like someone who's got something to say," he said, almost shyly. I thanked him. And that night, I began writing in it. Not memories this time. Not loss. But beginnings. Not what had been taken, but what I was now claiming. A list of boundaries. A recipe I wanted to try. Names of places I might want to visit. A thought I had about light and forgiveness and the silence between them. I wrote in that journal every night for 6 months. It became my mirror. My map. My slow reconstruction. And then, one day, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being alone. Not of being forgotten. Not of what people might think if I told them the truth. I'd begun to trust myself again. I met a woman named Celia at the Saturday farmers market. She sold handmade soaps and asked me if I lived nearby. I said yes. She invited me to a book club. I almost said no, out of habit, out of instinct, out of that old ache to keep myself protected. But I said yes instead. And it was one of the best choices I've made. The women there didn't know my past. They didn't ask what had happened. They only knew I liked historical fiction and peppermint tea and that I laughed when someone made a clever joke about Jane Austen. They welcomed me with gentle, effortless grace. And I let them. That was the hardest part. Letting people in again, even a little. Trust isn't something you get back all at once. It grows in slivers. But every time someone remembered my name or asked how my Rosemary was doing, I felt it, the quiet return of worth. I still didn't talk to my son. Not because I wanted to hurt him. But because healing sometimes means walking in the opposite direction and not looking back. They may never understand what they lost. They may never see how their decisions cut me out of my own life. And that's not mine to fix. What is mine? Is this life I've begun to build? Small. Unfancy. But rooted. Rooted in boundaries. In breath. In being seen, if only by the trees in the pages and the people who offer kindness without cost. I moved differently after that. Not just through the world, but within myself. No longer asking to be chosen. No longer proving I mattered. Because I do. And that is no longer a question I need anyone else to answer. I didn't vanish from their lives to punish them. But absence, when it stretches long enough, becomes a mirror. And in time, even they had to face it. I never told them where I went. No forwarding address. No emergency contact. No trail of breadcrumbs. I left nothing behind but a silence too solid to ignore. At first, I imagine they were relieved. That's the thing about people who rely on your sacrifice. When you stop offering yourself, they convince themselves you were never needed in the first place. But time has a way of unraveling that kind of story. Celia, from book club, works part-time as a nurse at the urgent care back in my old town. She told me, without knowing the names, that a man came in asking about power of attorney laws for his elderly mother. He seemed lost, she said. He thought he'd done the right thing, but it was clear something had slipped through his fingers. I knew. Even if she didn't. I knew who it was. Because that's what happens when you treat someone as disposable. Eventually, you look up and realize the glue is gone. They lost more than my presence. They lost what I held. The steady hands. The memory of birthdays. The quiet reminders. The unpaid babysitting. The emotional labor that stitched together the gaps they didn't even know they had. Holidays came and went. I didn't call. I didn't send cards. I didn't mail gifts, or cookies, or cash tucked into envelopes. That December, I walked through Elmbrook's tree lighting festival in the town square. Bundled in my coat, hands in my pockets, I listened to a little girl sing off-key carols while a man sold roasted chestnuts beside a fire barrel. No pressure to perform. No kitchen to clean. No tight smile to wear. Just winter air, music, and the unfamiliar lightness of being no one's expectation. I don't think they ever imagined I'd stay gone this long. They likely assumed I'd come back once the dust settled, maybe with tears, maybe with forgiveness, but certainly with the same apron tied around my waist. But people don't understand what happens when the person they erased learns to love herself in the quiet. I didn't return to a role. I outgrew it. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance from church, that the new owners of the house on Hemlock stripped the oak tree in the front yard. The one Leonard planted when our son was born. Gone. Just like that. They paved over the flower bed too. Covered it in concrete. She said it was a rental now. A revolving door. I closed my eyes when she told me. Not out of sorrow. Out of confirmation. That house was no longer sacred to anyone who remembered. It was just a building now. And that was fine. Because sacred things don't live in wood or walls. They live in the people who carry them. And I carried it all. They lost the only person who remembered the full story. Who knew which drawer held the scissors. Who saved the school reports. Who held the shameful secrets with dignity and silence. Who knew how to show up, again and again, without being asked. I wasn't just the mother. I was the archivist. The keeper. The quiet architect of the very structure they stood on. And when I left, that structure began to shake. I'm not saying their world collapsed. It didn't have to. But it grew colder. I could feel it, even from a distance. They'd have to buy birthday cakes now. Remember appointments themselves. Pay for childcare. Keep track of their own messes. I wonder if they ever realized that it wasn't just love I gave them, it was infrastructure. And when you dismantle the person holding that infrastructure, you learn quickly how much weight they carried. One afternoon, in the shop, a woman came in looking for a book for her mother. She said, "She's hard to buy for, you know? Always did everything for everyone. Now she doesn't want anything." I smiled softly. I think she probably just wants peace. She blinked, like the thought had never occurred to her. Then nodded. That's what they lost. The woman who asked for nothing but gave everything. The one who remembered how everyone liked their tea. The one who sat in hospital rooms, on bleachers, in long grocery lines with patience and grace. The one who believed that love meant staying. Even when staying meant being invisible. But I stopped believing that. And when I left, I took that belief with me. Now, they're left with the version of themselves that was never questioned. And that version is hollow. Impatient. Ungrateful. And I think they know it. Or they're beginning to. There's power in being gone. Not because your absence is vengeful, but because it reveals what your presence once concealed. The gaps. The needs. The unspoken dependencies. I haven't heard from them in nearly a year. Not a letter. Not a knock. Not a second voicemail. But I feel their confusion, the ache of it, drifting across time like fog. They don't know where I am. But they know I'm not where they left me. And that's enough. I never wanted them to suffer. I wanted them to see. To see the weight of my presence. To see the softness I carried without applause. To see the ways I held the family together, even as I unraveled. And perhaps, in my absence, they're finally beginning to look. But the thing about distance is, once you've built a life inside it, you don't need to close it again. I don't watch them from afar. I don't ask around. I don't haunt them in spirit or thought. I simply exist. Beyond them. And in doing so, I've gained something they may never have. Self-honesty. Stillness. And the kind of freedom you can't buy, borrow, or beg for. You only earn it. When you finally choose yourself. It was in late spring, maybe May, when I finally found the strength to write the letter. Not because I needed closure from them. Not because I expected an apology or explanation. But because there was a version of myself still caught in that old life, still frozen at the threshold of the house I never got to say goodbye to. She needed something from me. Not pity. Not revenge. Just a voice. A reckoning. I didn't start with their names. I started with mine. Dear Helen, I wrote. And then I stopped, because even that, addressing myself with kindness, felt like learning a new language. I had always written grocery lists, school notes, birthday cards. But I had never written to myself. Not like this. I began again. Dear Helen, you did more than they will ever know. And that is not your failure. That is their blindness. The words came slow, then faster. Like the slow trickle of water that eventually becomes a stream. I wrote about the night Leonard died. How I sat on the edge of the bed long after the nurse zipped the bag, because I didn't know how to leave the room as a widow. I wrote about the day my son fell off his bike and split his chin, how I rushed barefoot to carry him back home, blood dripping down both of us, and never once thought about what I'd stepped on. I wrote about the meals. The bills. The quiet. All the ways I made things possible for people who forgot to say thank you. I wrote about the holidays I spent trying to make magic out of coupons. The way I stayed up sewing costumes by hand because the store-bought ones were too expensive. The birthday cakes, the night shifts, the unspoken grief. I wrote until the pages curled and my hand ached. Not out of bitterness. But out of recognition. I had never been the type to demand credit. But now, I was giving it to myself. You kept showing up, I wrote. When you were exhausted. When you were invisible. When no one offered to hold what you were carrying. You kept showing up. That mattered. Even if they never said it. Even if they never understood. It mattered. And the more I wrote, the more I felt something loosen inside me, and not that had sat lodged beneath my ribs for years. It wasn't anger. Not anymore. It was mourning. For the life I thought I had. For the future I imagined, where I'd be part of their world, not exiled from it. I'd pictured Sunday dinners and sleepovers with grandkids and family photos where I wasn't just a shadow at the edge. That vision was gone. And grieving it fully was the only way to let it go. I wrote 10 pages that first afternoon. And then I set the pen down, made a cup of tea, and sat on the porch beneath the soft yellow light. The field in front of Evelyn's house swayed in the wind like a living sea. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. Not for their regret. Not for their call. Not for their guilt to catch up with them. I had waited long enough. The letter sat on my table for days, folded neatly. I didn't seal it. Didn't address it. It wasn't for mailing. It wasn't meant to be read by anyone but the air and whatever part of me still needed to hear it aloud. So one morning, after a light rain, I took it to the edge of the trail where the trees begin. There's a clearing there, small and wild, where the sunlight pools like gold on the moss. I sat on the ground, cross-legged, and read every word back to myself. I didn't cry. Not because it wasn't emotional. But because there was a steadiness in the grief now. Like a river that had found its bed. When I finished, I held the pages to my chest. Then I tore them, piece by piece. Not in rage. In release. Letting go of every what if, every why didn't they, every ache that had anchored me to a family that no longer existed. The pieces floated into the breeze like petals. And I whispered, "I see you now, Helen. I see you." It was the kindest thing I've ever said to myself. That evening, Evelyn brought me a slice of rhubarb pie. Said she made too much. We sat on her porch together, not talking about anything heavy, just the weather, the birds, the squirrels wreaking havoc on her tomatoes. And I felt light. Not because anything was fixed, but because something had shifted. I didn't need to be restored to their world. I had created my own. My story was no longer about what they did. It was about what I'd reclaimed. My voice. My peace. Myself. I still keep a journal. Not every day, but often. Sometimes I write to the version of me that stayed too long. Other times, I write to the version that finally walked away. And sometimes, I don't write at all. Sometimes I just sit by the window with a cup of tea, and listen to the quiet that no longer frightens me. I didn't burn bridges. I buried them. Gently. With prayer and permission. I don't know what they tell people now when they mention me, if they mention me. Maybe they say I drifted. Maybe they say I changed. Maybe they don't say anything at all. But I know what I would say. I would say I gave my life to people who didn't know how to hold it. And then I gave it back to myself. And that's not sad. That's sacred. Because not all losses are tragedies. Some are beginnings in disguise. And this was mine. My life is quiet now. Not empty. Not lonely. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps itself around your shoulders like a warm shawl. The kind you don't rush to fill. I wake up early most mornings, not because I have to, but because I want to. The light filters in through the curtain just after 6. It comes in soft and gold and kind. Some mornings, I lie there for a while and just listen to the world beginning. Birdsong. Wind. The sound of Evelyn's old cat scratching at the porch screen. It's all so ordinary, and yet it feels like ceremony. There's a ritual to my days now. I boil water for tea, not coffee, my stomach's grown too tender for the bitterness. I drink it by the window in my robe, watching the deer pick their way along the tree-line. No one calls during these hours. No one expects anything. I think that's what peace really is. Not the absence of sadness, but the absence of performance. I still work part-time at the bookstore. Arthur asked me if I wanted more hours, but I said no. I like having time, I told him. He nodded. Didn't press. It's a funny thing, time. When you're a mother, a wife, a caregiver. Your time belongs to everyone but you. Your hours are divided into service. Now, they belong to me. I use them well. I read. I journal. I walk. I started keeping a small garden behind the studio. Just pots, really, a few herbs, a tomato plant, some wildflowers. Every morning, I water them with a slow, careful hand. I talk to them, sometimes. Not with words, but with presence. And they grow. Steady. Unrushed. Unapologetic. Just like me. I don't check social media. I don't follow what my son or his family are doing. Not because it hurts, not anymore. But because that story isn't mine to chase. I have no need to know if they've missed me. That part of the wound has healed over. Smooth. Scarred. But closed. Sometimes, I see a family at the market or the library, a grandmother laughing with her grandchild, and I feel something stir. Not envy. Not grief. Just awareness. Of the life I once imagined I'd have. Of the one I now live instead. And both are valid. But only one is mine. I've made friends here. Real ones. Celia and I walk together on Saturdays. We talk about books, the garden, the weather. She never asks about my past. She just meets me where I am. That, I've learned, is the rarest kind of friendship. The kind that doesn't need a history to feel like home. Every month, I set aside a day for what I call stillness. No errands. No phone. No lists. Just breath. Just being. It's taken me decades to understand that rest is not laziness. That silence is not absence. That solitude is not failure. They are gifts. Hard-won. Sacred. Sometimes, I write a letter I'll never send. To Leonard. To the version of my son who once held my hand in the grocery store parking lot. To myself, at 35, on the edge of collapse. I fold them, seal them, place them in a small wooden box on my shelf. It's my way of saying, I see you. I remember. I forgive. Not everything can be undone. Not every wound can be reconciled. But they can be witnessed. And witnessing, I've found, is its own form of healing. There's a man in town, Bill, who runs the antique store near the post office. He always saves old recipe cards for me when he finds them. I told him I like reading the handwriting. He smiled and said, "It's like ghosts speaking gently." I understood what he meant. I keep a few of those cards pinned on the wall now. Not because I'll cook from them, but because they feel like love notes left behind by strangers. Proof that someone once cared enough to write a dash of salt in perfect cursive. It reminds me that care doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be real. That's how I live now. With realness. With gentleness. With fewer things, but more meaning. I don't chase closure anymore. I don't rehearse the confrontation that will never happen. I don't need justice in the way I once thought I did. Because I found something better. Peace. Not as a reward. But as a choice. There's a kind of quiet I never knew existed, not the quiet of loneliness, but the quiet of self-belonging. I sit with it every evening as the sun folds itself behind the trees. And I let it hold me. Sometimes I think of the life I left behind. Not with sadness. But with respect for the woman who finally walked away from it. She didn't burn down bridges. She simply stopped crossing ones that only led her back into erasure. That was brave. Even if no one else ever says it. So I say it now. Helen, you were brave. You let go. You began again. And this quiet, this stillness, this slow-blooming peace, it is your reward. It is enough. It is more than enough. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. Sometimes I wonder what they'd see if they ran into me now. Not the shell they built with their neglect. Not the tired woman they quietly stepped over like a coat on the floor. Not the mother they recast as nuisance. But this version of me. The one who knows how to start her day in stillness and not apology. The one who no longer flinches when the phone doesn't ring. The one who remembers who she was before she was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's unpaid servant. I live by a small lake now. I moved here 6 months after that last letter. Not because I was running, but because the world opened wider and I wanted to step into more of it. The lake isn't big or dramatic. It doesn't shimmer like those tourist postcards. But it's mine. The landlady, a widow named Marin, gave me a deal on the little cabin out back. Said it had been empty for years and needed someone gentle to bring it back to life. I laughed when she said that. She didn't know how accurate she was. I spent the first few weeks sweeping out cobwebs and sanding down window frames. I planted lavender and lemon balm by the steps. Hung a small chime made from broken spoons. And one day, without planning to, I caught my reflection in the cabin's front window and said out loud, "This suits you." I hadn't spoken kindly to my reflection in decades. Now I do it often. Not out of vanity, but as a practice. As proof that I exist outside of what others think of me. I'm not performing for anyone anymore. That has become the centerpiece of my life, living without performance. I don't pretend to be okay when I'm not. But I also don't bleed to prove I'm hurting. I've learned the language of balance. There's an honesty in solitude that no relationship ever gave me. Some days are quiet in the achy way. I won't pretend otherwise. Grief has a long memory. And even now, I find myself brushing past it like a familiar branch along a trail. But it doesn't drag me under anymore. I let myself feel it. Then I turn toward something else. A walk. A book. A pot of soup on the stove. I've learned that healing is not an event. It's a rhythm. A long, slow dance with the parts of yourself you had once ignored in order to be loved. And now that I love them, all of them, I find I need far less from the world. My needs are simpler, but more sacred. Good bread. Clean sheets. A conversation that doesn't end with me second-guessing my worth. I talk to Marin most evenings. We sit on her porch with chamomile tea and watch the sun skim across the water like a soft hand. She has stories. Widows always do. We don't fix each other. We don't give advice. We just bear witness. And I've learned how rare that is, to be seen without being studied. To be known without being managed. I never had that in my old life. Back then, my value came from how much I could lighten someone else's load. How much I could remember for them. How quickly I could fold myself in half to meet their expectations. But now, I unfold. Each day, in small ways. A new recipe. A walk I haven't taken. A journal entry that surprises me. This unfolding isn't flashy. It isn't the kind of thing that earns applause. But it is sacred. And slow. And honest. I don't think they'll ever see this version of me. Not because I'm hiding. But because I've stopped sending invitations to people who don't value the RSVP. If they called, I wouldn't hang up. But I wouldn't rush to rescue either. I wouldn't shrink to fit the mold they left behind. They'd be speaking to a woman they don't recognize. A woman who no longer needs their approval to feel real. I think about that sometimes, what it means to grow so far beyond someone that even your shadow no longer fits their frame. I think that's what peace is. Not erasing the past. But growing beyond it so fully that it can no longer anchor you. Some days, I watch families walk around the lake. Children tugging at parents' hands. Laughter floating like petals in the breeze. And I feel no bitterness. Because I know what I gave. And I know what it cost. And I know what I finally kept. That last part, what I kept, is the story now. They'll never know the woman who wakes at dawn to write a poem just because. They'll never know the one who hums while washing dishes. The one who learned how to slow her breath when the old ache tries to return. The one who made peace with silence and turned it into music. But I know her. And she knows me. And that, I've learned, is enough. I'm not looking for a new ending. I'm living a new middle. Steady. Whole. Unapologetically mine. So if you're watching this, if you've ever been the one forgotten, the one written out, the one replaced with a shrug, please know, there is life on the other side. There is breath. There is rest. There is joy that doesn't need an audience. You don't need them to come back to feel whole. You don't need to be understood to be valid. You only need to reclaim the version of yourself that you abandoned to keep others comfortable. That version is still in you. Still waiting. Still radiant. I'm living proof. They'll never meet this version of me. And that's their loss. Because I am more alive now than I ever was while begging to be seen. And that is the quiet miracle I wake up to every day. It was a Thursday. Late August. The kind of day where the sun hovers low and gold across everything, like it's reluctant to leave. I had just come back from the market with a loaf of sourdough, some rosemary sprigs, and a jar of blackberry preserves. Marin had asked me to stay for tea later, and I'd said yes, because our conversations were beginning to feel like the last stitch on a handmade quilt. Quiet, personal, and something you only notice when it's missing. When I opened my mailbox that afternoon, there was only one envelope inside. Plain. White. No return address. At first, I assumed it was a bill or a misplaced advertisement. But as I turned it over in my hand, I felt it. That tug. That knowing. The way your body recognizes a name before your mind dares say it aloud. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen table beside the bread and the jar of jam. I brewed tea, changed into my house shoes, and swept the porch. I watered the plants, straightened the cushions, then finally sat down with the letter still sealed and waiting. The handwriting was unmistakable. My son's. I had to sit still for a while just to let the wave of recognition pass. It didn't bring grief. It didn't bring rage. It just brought silence. A kind of pause I hadn't felt in a long while. I opened it slowly, the paper softer than I expected, as if it had been folded and refolded many times before it reached me. It wasn't long. 1 page. Blue ink. Careful strokes. He began with Mom, and I noticed that even now, that word didn't sting. Then came a line I had never expected to read, I know I was wrong. I read that sentence 3 times. Not because I needed to believe it, but because I needed to see if it felt true. He went on to say that he hadn't understood, not really. That he thought he was helping, simplifying, protecting. That he hadn't realized how much of my identity was tangled into that house, that life, that quiet dignity I wore like a second skin. He said that when I disappeared, he assumed it was a phase. That I'd call, angry or hurt, and eventually fold back into the place he'd always kept for me, at the edge of his world. But when I didn't, something shifted. He wrote that holidays felt hollow. That the house, the new house, didn't feel like a home. That his children asked why Grandma wasn't there anymore, and he didn't have an answer that made sense. He wrote that he drove to the old street once, parked in front of the house that no longer belonged to us, and cried. He wrote that he'd spoken to someone, a counselor, maybe. I'm not sure. He didn't give details. But he wrote about guilt like it was something he was finally willing to carry. I understand now that I didn't just sell a house, he wrote. I dismantled the sanctuary of someone who made me who I am. He ended with a question. Can I see you? I folded the letter back into thirds. Not out of anger. Not out of indecision. But because I needed space to feel the full weight of it. There was a time, not too long ago, when I would have read that letter and rushed to respond. Packed a bag. Made a list. Found a ride. I would have arrived at his door with forgiveness already written across my face like a badge. But I'm not that woman anymore. And my forgiveness doesn't come tied with urgency. I sat with the letter all evening. Brought it with me to Marin's porch. Told her, carefully, what it was. She didn't offer advice. She simply said, you don't owe anyone your peace. That night, I dreamt of the younger version of myself. Not the mother, not the wife. Just Helen. Barefoot in a kitchen filled with light. Laughing. Free. I woke up with tears on my cheeks, and I knew something important had happened in the quiet space of sleep. I wasn't ready to see him. But I was ready to answer. So I sat at my desk, pulled out a sheet of soft paper, and began to write. Dear James, I started. I hadn't written his name in years. Not like this. I told him I'd received his letter. That I believed his words were honest. That I didn't hate him, never had. That the silence wasn't punishment, it was self-preservation. I told him I had forgiven him long before his letter came, but not because he'd asked for it. Because I needed to let go. Because I needed my life back. I told him I was not the woman he last saw. That I had changed in ways I could not fully explain on paper. That he may want to see me, but he should be prepared to meet someone he doesn't fully know anymore. I told him I was well. Not in spite of what happened, but because I chose to build something beautiful in the aftermath. I didn't say where I was. I didn't invite a visit. I didn't close the door either. I ended with this: if you want to know me now, you'll have to come without expectations. You'll have to come as a man, not as a son expecting the same story to play again. If you can do that, write me again. I signed it simply, Helen. I mailed it the next morning, then walked to the lake and sat in the sun with a new journal in my lap. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel afraid. I felt still. Whatever happens next is not about fixing the past. It's about deciding whether the future is worth starting from where we truly are, strangers who once shared everything, trying to learn how to meet each other again, without scripts, without old debts. He may write again. Or he may not. But either way, I've already won. Because the version of me that couldn't have written that letter, she's gone. And the woman who did. She's the one I always hoped I'd become. There's a freedom in knowing you don't have to say everything. Not every wound needs a witness. Not every truth needs to be spoken aloud to be real. Some things are best honored in silence, in breath, in the soft space between what was and what will never be again. I sent the letter. And then I waited. Not with the old kind of waiting, not the fidgeting, hopeful, heart-tight waiting of a mother still begging to be seen. This was different. It was a still, patient kind of waiting. The kind you do when you've already made peace with either outcome. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. No reply. No knock on the door. No email. No call. I didn't check the mailbox with urgency. I didn't lose sleep. I didn't build stories around his silence. I just lived. The days stretched soft and familiar, morning tea, tending the rosemary, folding laundry by the window while the lake shimmered in the background like an old friend who never asked anything of me. One morning, I found a small bird on my doorstep. It wasn't hurt. Just sitting there, still, alert, breathing fast. I crouched beside it and whispered, "You don't have to fly yet." It blinked, then fluttered off into the trees. And I thought, that's me. Not caged. Not lost. Just pausing. I didn't need James to write back. But part of me had wondered, if he did, what would he say? Would he come in gentleness? Or in defense, still tangled in the past, trying to make his version of events feel lighter on the tongue? Would he ask for details, for the long list of everything I carried, of every moment they missed, of every unspoken forgiveness I granted them while sitting alone in rooms they never bothered to enter? And if he did ask, would I answer? That's the question I kept circling in the quiet hours. What would I say if I had the chance to say it all? And the truth is, I wouldn't say much. Because when someone hasn't earned the softness of your truth, you don't hand it over like a gift. You keep it. You place it gently in your own pocket. You let it warm there, close to the place where your breath begins. He doesn't need to know everything. He doesn't need to know that I used to keep every one of his childhood drawings in a worn blue folder under my bed. That I cried when his voice changed because it meant he was leaving childhood behind and I hadn't gotten enough of it. He doesn't need to know that I used to replay old voicemails just to hear him say hi, Mom, when I missed being called something other than Helen. He doesn't need to know that I almost came back once, the Christmas after everything, just to leave cookies on their porch and see the glow of light from inside. He doesn't need to know the cost of my silence. How much discipline it took not to reach for the familiar ache of his voice. Because this peace I've built, this soft, sturdy home inside myself, it wasn't easy. It wasn't born out of comfort. It was carved from pain. And I protect it now. With boundaries. With grace. With restraint. That's something no one taught me, how to guard peace once you find it. I used to think love meant telling everything. Explaining. Unraveling yourself so the other person could see where it hurt. But now, I know that sometimes love is choosing what not to say. Not out of secrecy. But out of sovereignty. And there's a difference. If he writes again, I'll read it. But I won't hand over my entire story. Not unless he comes with hands open, not clenched. Not unless he's willing to sit in the discomfort of the truth without trying to change its shape. The version of me who needed him to understand no longer leads my life. She rests now. Tended. Safe. Sometimes, I write letters I don't send. Letters to Leonard. Letters to my younger self. Letters to the version of James I still miss. The little boy with skinned knees and big questions and a laugh that shook his whole body. I write to him like he's still in there somewhere. Maybe he is. Maybe he's not. Either way, I no longer need to reach in and find him. That's his work to do now. My work is different. My work is gentler, quieter. It lives in the garden beds I've started planting out back. In the spiced tea I share with Marin on windy afternoons. In the poems I write in my journal without worrying if they're good. It lives in the peace I feel when I fall asleep with the window open and the wind humming through the trees. It lives in this version of me, whole, rooted, soft-edged but strong. There are things I'll never say. Because I don't need to say them to be free of them. That's the miracle. You don't have to be heard to heal. You don't have to be understood to release the weight. You don't have to explain yourself to earn peace. You just have to choose it. Over and over. And I do. Every time I choose not to reach back into that fire. Every time I choose presence over pain. Every time I wake up and don't check the mail with hope knotted in my gut. I choose it. And maybe one day, he'll come. Or maybe he won't. But either way, I know what I won't say. I won't say, you broke me, because he didn't. I won't say, you owe me everything, because I've released the ledger. I won't say, I was waiting, because I'm not. I will say only this. I found myself in the absence. And she was more than enough. And then I'll go on living this quiet life I've built. Not perfectly. Not untouched by memory. But fully, bravely, without explanation.